Hi, I want to talk to you today about conquering shame. Now, shame is a universal emotion, and there is no healthy person who never feels any shame. And so we're not going to conquer all shame, but what I want to help you to begin to understand is how to conquer toxic shame. Some shame is normal for human beings to experience. When I talked about people who are character disordered in our last month's video, one of the problems with these kind of people is that they don't have enough normal guilt or shame to stop themselves from doing certain things. Our God-given conscience, both individually as well as the collective conscience for a group or the family or community, is set up for us to experience healthy guilt as well as healthy shame when we violate our own internal values or the values and morals of the group. For example, let's say that your morals say that you should be kind to elderly people, and in a moment of crabbiness, you're disrespectful to an old person and call them a name. Well, if you're healthy, your conscience should bother you some, with guilt and shame, guilt that you did something wrong, you shouldn't have called them a name, and a little bit of shame in your thought with, what's wrong with me that I would treat someone like that? Now, these are good questions to ask yourself that invite healthy self-awareness and self-reflection over your own behaviors and attitudes. Being aware of how you behave and why you do what you do helps you live with integrity, because it helps you self-correct and make amends when you see you've crossed the lines of your own values. Also, an important part of normal or healthy shame is that it helps us be aware of our limitations. As human beings, we don't know it all. We can't do it all. We can't be everywhere for everyone, nor are we perfect all of the time. And so healthy shame reminds us of our shortcomings and limits as human beings and humbles us in a good way. Now, some of you may have taken my 2-session core focus class where I draw this big circle of the healthy self. And we have good and bad, strong and weak, beautiful and ugly qualities to all of us. And having a healthy self says we can work on our flaws and weaknesses, but healthy shame also keeps us aware that we will never come to a place where we never have any. But so many people are split off and they're only seeing either all their good parts or all their bad parts. But normal shame, like Adam and Eve experienced in the Garden of Eden when they were naked, they tried fixing their problem with fig leaves. Normal shame keeps us aware that we cannot fix our own problems by ourselves. Normal shame creates a place in us for God because we become aware that we are not Him. That's a good thing, and that we need Him. Let me just add that shame is a little different than guilt. Again, usually after we violate someone's moral code or God's moral code, we feel guilty, as we should. Guilt tells us that we've done something wrong and that we need to stop. Unhealthy guilt, however, is usually triggered when you continually feel guilty for violating someone else's moral code, not necessarily your own or even God's. For example, perhaps you grew up obeying your mother, her code, which was, you should never disappoint me in any way. Or maybe you've adopted your husband's code that you shall always put me first before everyone else and make me happy. Now, of course, when you can't live up to those codes or rules, or you won't, your mom or your husband get mad or hurt, and then you start to feel guilty as if you've done something wrong, even when you haven't. But you did fail to live up to their rule. And because you've put that person in the God position of your life, you will feel guilty when you violate their law or their rule or their code. And even Jesus didn't do what people wanted him to do, but he never felt guilty because he only lived by God's law, not by humans. But I'll talk more about unhealthy guilt in another video. Normal shame, healthy guilt are necessary for any society to function properly. It keeps sinful human beings from doing some horrible and mean things to one another that we might feel like doing in a moment of anger, but we don't do because it would make us feel bad about ourselves for doing them. Feeling healthy guilt about something usually persuades us to change and make amends about what we've done. It also provides a fear of punishment, which is a good thing because it deters us into continued wrongdoing. Having healthy shame and healthy guilt is one of the big differences between relatively healthy people and those individuals that I talked about in our last video that have character disorders that we talked about in Conquering Crazy Making. However, I want to remind you, although it's important to feel healthy shame and guilt, the more neurotic we are, all right, the more we're over on this side of the continuum, the more likely we are to be burdened with unhealthy guilt and unhealthy shame. So what I want to help you start to address and conquer today is unhealthy or toxic shame. Now, that kind of shame has been called by John Paul Sartre the hemorrhage of the soul, and it differs from unhealthy guilt. Here's the main difference. Guilt makes you feel like you did something wrong, even if you didn't. But toxic shame makes you feel like you are something wrong. Toxic shame doesn't just make you feel limited or humble or small, which is the function of normal shame. Toxic shame makes you feel inferior, unworthy, deficient, undesirable as a human being. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am wrong. It's not about my behaviors, it's about my identity. I'm unacceptable as a human being. I'm damaged goods. I'm a loser. I'm unworthy of love, unworthy of affection, attention, care. I don't belong. So where does this kind of unhealthy shame come from? Primarily by being shamed by others who see us. Let me give you some simple examples. And I'm going to be gross, but it's the simplest way I can explain it. Let's say that you pass gas or have to clean out your nose, and these are normal human functions. We all have to do them, and we usually feel absolutely no guilt or shame about them. Unless we just picked our nose or passed gas and see out of the corner of our eye that our colleagues saw us do it. Then this horrible feeling washes over us, right? They saw us doing something rather human, something everyone does, but we feel shame, especially if they tease or mock us about it as if they don't do the very same thing. So when someone sees our human vulnerabilities, especially our weaknesses or limitations or flaws, or our neediness, and makes fun of us, demeans us, or rejects us for those things, we tend to feel incredible shame and determine, especially when we're younger, that we must be wrong for having them, and therefore unlovable, or unworthy, undesirable, flawed, or insignificant. Sometimes even if we feel proud about something, a good grade or a home run or a beautiful dress we're wearing, and someone makes fun of you with a negative remark, oh, you think you're all that, or you think too much of yourself, we start to feel ashamed of feeling good. You see, our sense of ourself begins to be formed in childhood, actually in infancy, when we begin to get an experience of ourselves through the eyes of another. In that experience, we either feel loved, valuable, and important, or we feel like we're a bother, we're insignificant, or don't matter. And some of us feel somewhere in between those two things. When a baby cries and needs comfort, is she soothed and comforted, or is she scolded? Are her legitimate needs tended to, or are they ignored? And if she's ignored or shamed or scolded, her legitimate human need for affirmation, attention, comfort, support, information will start to feel shameful, like she's bad for having them. And she'll begin to reject those parts of herself. To make this even more clear, let me give you another example. Recently, one of my coaching clients sent her 2-year-old daughter to her grandma's house for the night. The little girl wanted to sleep over at grandma's, but when it got to bedtime, she changed her mind. She missed her mom. She started feeling scared and began crying. All normal for a 2-year-old. But grandma, in her own disappointment and hurt that her little grandchild didn't want to stay overnight, began to convince the baby to stay and to stop crying. She finally got frustrated and said, oh, you're just being a baby. And the baby cried harder and harder, and grandma, in her frustration, called her daughter and angrily said, come and pick up your daughter. She's acting like a baby. Well, she was a baby. She was only 2 years old. But this child got a sense from her grandma that in that moment she was bad and her feelings were unacceptable. When my client was sharing this with me, the light bulb went on for her as to why she never let herself feel sad and scared feelings. Because they were unacceptable, shameful. They made her feel small and needy and vulnerable and rejected. And she realized that growing up that her mother couldn't handle her negative emotions or her own neediness. And my client learned as a child that her needs overwhelmed her mom, and therefore she shouldn't have needs. She should take care of her mom's feelings instead of having any of her own. And now, as an adult, when she cries or feels hurt or scared because of being human, she berates herself for it. I'm stupid. I'm just having a pity party. I'm a baby. Something's wrong with me. She loathes herself for wanting or needing comfort and validation, affirmation, very normal human things. But somehow she's come to believe that she's undeserving, unworthy of such normal human things because she's flawed, defective, damaged. This is toxic shame. And you can see why toxic shame is soul destroying. And when we're in it, we want to do whatever we can to get away from that feeling, including denying parts of ourselves or splitting off parts of ourselves so we don't have to feel them. But unfortunately, unless we're aware of what's going on inside, the typical way we try to get away from toxic shame is either through medicating, drugs and alcohol, distracting ourselves, getting really, really busy, or other addictions such as working harder and harder and harder for just some sort of approval or validation. Or we become totally unconscious to our own feelings, deadening ourselves inside, over-functioning for others, or even having rage attacks and shutting down into depression. our self starts to become broken and we start to disintegrate. And if we do it a lot, we become blind or defended against certain traits, believing that we don't have them. No, I'm not angry. No, I don't need anything from anyone. No, I don't care. In other words, we're denying our very humanness. No, I never burp or pass gas or pick my nose. How could you think of such a thing of me? Now, if we're shamed, we also may be split off from the good things about us. Perhaps you showed talent as a child and you were told you were showing off or prideful. Or you had a good idea and you were told you were ridiculous. And so we start to shrink smaller and smaller and smaller. So what can you do if you recognize that this is something that you struggle with? Remember, when we talked about conquering fear, you have to face and name your fear instead of running from it or deny it. So when this horrible feeling of toxic shame washes over you, you'll know it by the harsh inner self-talk you'll start to have. I'm a loser, I'm flawed, I'm unworthy, I hate myself, what's wrong with me, I can't do anything right, I deserve to die, I'm no good. And this horrible feeling will be like a wash, a chemical wash. Name the feeling. It's toxic shame that has just hit you, a shame attack. Now what? The monster's in the room, and what are you going to do with it? Well, instead of shutting down or attacking someone else or getting busy and medicating yourself with 3 glasses of wine, do something different. Practice compassion and empathy for yourself. Yes, it hurts to want someone to care for you over Christmas, to reach out and call you or take some time out of their busy schedule to see how you're doing. And it's sad that it didn't happen this year for many of you. But that doesn't mean you're bad or unworthy. Or, it does hurt that your husband doesn't appreciate you, your kids don't value you right now. But it's not a statement about you. In other words, validate your need. Embrace that part of you that you're rejecting. I know you wanted compassion right now. It's okay to want that. I know you were angry right there. It's okay to feel your anger. That was hurtful. Respond to your inner shame monster as if you were a healthy, good mother responding to a hurt child who was telling herself lies about why something happened. I remember once I had a little client, she was 8 years old, who accidentally stepped on her brother's hamster when it was running across the floor and broke his back and it died. And she told herself, I'm bad, I'm clumsy, I'm a horrible sister, I'm a klutz. I said to her, honey, you're not that, you're human. You didn't know the hamster was loose. It was just bad timing that you came into the room right then when he was running loose. You couldn't know. Do you hear the difference? Healthy shame would grieve over her human limitations. I didn't know. Toxic shame feels like she was bad for not knowing. Another thing you can do is start to rewrite the movie in your head. For this young girl with the hamster story, she needs to see it in a more truthful way. And a good mother would have rewritten the story for her daughter. No, it's not bad that you didn't know. You're just human. Joseph did this with his brothers in Genesis. When they were collapsing into guilt and shame for what they did, he said, what you meant for evil, God actually used for good. And as you rewrite your story, don't just use words. Use your imagination. Picture it as if you were creating a new movie in your head. As we learned from our last video on trauma, many of our childhood memories are not in words, but in pictures and bodily sensations. And these memories need to be healed through new pictures and new sensations. And so use your holy imagination to create new movies of how things are. Not how you thought they were, but how they really were. And the more you do this, the more help for your brain to realign itself to the truthful pictures and images, and it begins to change and rewire those neurons. One of the best things that you can do to conquer shame is to get and build positive, loving support. Our emotions need to be heard and seen without judgment or condemnation. Sure, we may need advice or correction at times, but without rejection or contempt for them. Our Conquer Facebook group has been a great place for you to dump out some negative feelings and be validated, to be seen and heard and acknowledged that you are worth listening to. As you do this so lovingly with one another, you are being seen, you are being heard, you are being valued, and you're experiencing the truth that you have a valid perspective. You are a worthwhile, lovable, valuable human being. You know, a loving community is crucial to conquering toxic shame. That's why sex addicts and alcoholics find so much healing when they actually apply the 12-step group, where they can be honest and accepted, even though their lives may be a mess. When people see us, even our flaws and our weaknesses, our humanness, and still love us, it's healing and restorative and freeing. You are a finite, limited human being. That's healthy shame. But you're still valuable and lovable and worthwhile. How do I know? God says so. Another thing you can do is strengthen your internal boundaries. We've already talked about building better external boundaries in our Conquering Boundaries video, but we also need to build some good boundaries internally. As I'm reading through Proverbs this year, one of the things it says, and the purpose of writing the book of Proverbs is to teach us wisdom, but it's also to teach us discipline so that we will have a prosperous and purposeful life. So discipline yourself to take better care of yourself. Get enough sleep, eat better, exercise. Decide I'm not going to allow myself to beat myself up anymore, just like you're not allowing your spouse to beat yourself up anymore. How you treat you is just as important as how you allow others to treat you. So learn to be kind to yourself as you build new strength. Sometimes we are just very impatient with ourselves, and we have low ability to tolerate our own frustration and our own weaknesses and our own mistakes. Give yourself grace. Take deep breaths when you start to feel that defective, inferior, flawed feeling. And instead of letting anger, contempt at yourself get the upper hand, practice breathing, reflecting, observing, and calming self-talk. And see how that helps you manage situations better and build your ability to handle more and more difficult things with grace and core strength. You see, we can start to feel that ugly shame when our longings surface, our longings for love, understanding, connection, validation, and we're failed again and again. And it's also triggered when we fail ourselves. And instead of grieving our loss or limitations, our humanness, which is healthy shame, we fall into toxic shame, condemning our soul for being so stupid as to try or want or wish for more. Instead of rejecting yourself, accept yourself in all your humanness, the good parts and the bad parts, the beautiful parts and the ugly parts, the strong parts and the weak parts. You see, a healthy sense of self and shame come when we experience all of who we are, knowing that we're not enough in ourselves. We still need God. But that we are not less than others either. We are just beautiful but broken, finite, limited human beings, and that's fine with us. There is no toxic shame in being who you really are. Until next time, God bless.